I've got a brand new product to show you, and it's super pretty, and it's going on the front of this blanket box, which at first glance might look okay, but it's actually completely useless because it's got no base. What good is a blanket box without a base? You can't store anything in it, it's pointless. It's also pretty dirty. 2 of the legs were also heavily damaged, so I had to take the legs off and completely replace all 4. I also put a new base in the bottom as well, so that you can actually store something in. The little bit of detail that's on the front of the box was just basically a very thin piece of wood that was stuck on, and that's where I'm going to put my decoupage paper. So that just came off with a scraper and I sanded it smooth. Then I primed with Dixie Belle's Bond Emboss. You don't have to sand with this product because it's an adhesion primer and a stain blocking primer in one. The colour that I'm going to use is Smoky Mountains, which is a really nice shade of muted green with undertones of blue and grey. That sounds very fancy, but it's a very nice muted green. And then the panel that's on the front of the blanket box where I'm going to apply my decoupage paper, I undercoated in white because I always do that under decoupage. And then once it was dry, I could get the brand new decoupage paper out. This is it. It's called Peaceful Peonies. The print is huge, as in the scale itself is big, and the actual size of the paper is massive as well. So I just trimmed it down, and I'm going to keep the offcut for a different project because there's far too much paper there to throw away. All the offcuts get used for something eventually. And then I stuck the piece of decoupage paper down with Dixie Belle's satin clear coat, and I also sealed it with exactly the same product as well. That's going to help protect the paper. Once it was dry, I then trimmed it down with a craft knife. I always do this when it's dry because the paper is less likely to tear once it's dried. And then because this vintage blanket box was kind of a bit battered and not perfect, I'm just going to blend the edge where the paper meets the paint to give a kind of softer look. So I used a dry brush and just literally ran that across the edge of the paper. And again, that's going to kind of just soften that harsh edge up a little bit and just give it a bit more faded vintage look. Here's a little close-up of that gorgeous paper on the front of the blanket box, a reminder of what the piece looked like before, and here's the after. This makeover definitely isn't for everyone, but wouldn't it be boring if we all like the same thing? The table that I'm working on is in very poor condition and it was a bit rickety. There were some chunks taken out of the legs, so I'm not going to fight it. I'm going to embrace it and I'm going to make it look old and a little bit worn and a little bit pre-loved, but I'm going to add some colour to it. So the first thing I did is went in with the textured base of white paint, and then I'm going to use a product called Crackle, which actually makes your paint crackle. You paint it on, you leave it to dry, and then you apply your paint in one direction over the top of it, which makes your paint crack, which gives you a really cool aged look. So I'm using the colour Daffodil here from Terry Clay Paint, and as you can see, I'm just trying to brush it on in one direction so that my paint crackles where I've applied that crackle medium underneath. Then I moved on to the drawer front, and I wanted to add something really quirky and fun to that, so I actually used a paper napkin to decoupage the drawer front, and I used this really quirky folk art kind of design. I used clear coat top coat to act as a medium to stick it down and also to seal it, and then I just trimmed around the edges with sandpaper to give me a nice smooth edge. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this table was not in the best condition. It had obvious signs of wear and tear, and it had lots and lots of character and patina. So I'm working with that and I'm distressing it. In areas I sanded back so you could see some of the white base colour that I applied first, and in some areas I'm taking it back to the dark wood underneath to give that chippy kind of worn look. Once I distressed it to the position where I was happy with it, I then applied a top coat all over, and this is called Terra Tough. This has been specially formulated to be used with Terra Clay Paint, which is a very unique formula paint, and it does require a top coat. Until then it is porous. I also use the same top coat to seal the drawer front as well, and then I added some Best Down Wax in brown to just add a little bit more aging and dimension and depth to it as well. I concentrated this around the edges and corners just to give that kind of shading and dimension to this piece, and again just to add a little bit more aging. I buffed it out with a cloth to give it a nice sheen, and then I wanted to add a real strong pop of colour on the interior of the drawer just to contrast with the yellow exterior. Here's a couple of close-ups of that really cool crackle effect and the little decoupage drawer, which I think just looks super cute. Here's a reminder of what the piece looked like before, and here's the after. Sometimes things don't always go to plan, and this blanket box was no exception. I started out with a plan and then changed it halfway through, but I'm glad I did. So first of all, I started out with a little bit of prep. I cleaned it, and then I started sanding the frame because I was going to do a paint wood combo. The product that I'm using now is a water-based wood stain, and it's really good if you want to lighten your wood and give it that kind of bleached wood effect, which is the effect that I wanted to initially go for. I will list all of the products in the description below if you missed them in my voiceover. The front panels I was going to decoupage, and and I painted those in white because I always undercoat my decoupage in white. And then all of the other panels were going to be painted in this dark grey shade, which is called Midnight Sky. And that's when I was kind of like nah about it, and I wanted to introduce a lot more of a vibrant colour. So I grabbed this colour from Silk Mineral Paint and went over the entire thing, excluding those front white panels, because I was still going to stick to my plan and decoupage those. To stick the decoupage paper down, I'm going to use Dixie Belle's clear coat and just apply a thin line at the very top so that I can just line it up before applying clear coat underneath the rest of the paper, and then just smoothing it all down with cling film. Once that was dry, I applied another coat of clear coat over the top of the paper, and that's just going to help protect it. I used black wax to add a little bit of dimension on the panel detail on the top because it was just one colour. This is just going to add a little bit of shading in the areas, and I just wiped the excess off with a microfiber cloth. The interior of the box was in pretty good condition, so I just refreshed what was already there using Big Mama's butter in Orange Grove, which smells absolutely phenomenal. This wax can be used over existing finishes, so there was no need for me to strip the existing finish off the interior of this blanket box. It also covers up light swirls and scratch marks, and once I'd applied it all over, I just buffed the excess off with a lint-free rag. As always, I'll show you a few close-ups of the finished piece, and I'm just really glad I changed my mind and changed the direction that this was going, because I just think this colour really sets the decoupage paper off beautifully. Just as a reminder, this is the blanket box when I first got it into my workshop before I started on it, and here's the final piece. Here's how I took a vintage blanket box from basic to beautiful. As you'll notice, the top had some flaky varnish on the top, and it also had these awful dated patterns on the front, which I immediately filled in with wood filler. When the filler was drying, I sanded off the top to make sure there was no flaky varnish and it was nice and smooth, and then when the filler was dry, I sanded that smooth as well. I wanted a kind of faded colour wash to this piece, so I watered down some clay paint. This is the colour Cerulean Blue from Terra Clay Paint, and then painted it on. Once it was on and before it started drying, I removed a little bit with a rag just to reveal the wood underneath. So this is just going to pull back the blue paint and reveal areas of the wood to kind of give me a faded look. Once that first colour wash would dry, I started to build up the coverage on the bottom of the blanket box using exactly the same colour, but this time I didn't water down the paint. I'm just adding it really slowly so that I get a gradual fade from the top of the blanket box down to the bottom where it's going to be a more solid colour. I also used a sanding sponge just to reveal parts of the wood where I wanted it to peek through the paint, and this is just going to help me give that kind of faded look that I wanted, so that I've got more wood exposed on the top and then a more solid blue colour at the bottom. My plan for the two front panels was to add decoupage onto them, so I taped them off with painter's tape, and then I added a base coat of white paint. This is the colour Saltwater from Silk Mineral Paint, which has got a built-in primer and a built-in top coat. It's what I usually use under decoupage to give me a nice crisp finish. The decoupage paper I'm going to use is called Lovely Sonnet from Dixie Belle Paint, and it is a rather large sheet of paper, so I'm going to chop it down so that I've got some more manageable sized pieces, and I'm just going to leave a slight overhang on each of the panels. To stick the decoupage paper down, I'm going to use a top coat from Dixie Belle. Yes, this is a top coat, and yes, you can use it to apply decoupage with, and you can also use it to seal decoupage with as well. So I just applied a thin layer all over the white base and then took the masking tape off. Before that top coat had had a chance to dry, I then stuck down my decoupage paper using my finger to just very gently press out any wrinkles. I also use the thingamajig tool, which is a rubber multi-purpose tool, just to smooth it down a little bit further, and you can also get in all the corners and edges to make sure that they don't lift as well. Once the paper had completely dried, and that is very important because if you try and do this when it's wet, it will rip the paper because it is only a very thin tissue paper, I trimmed it down using a metal ruler and a really sharp craft knife. Once it was all trimmed down, I added a final top coat to seal in the decoupage paper, which is called Terra Tough, and this is a top coat especially used for Terra Clay Paint. And then I added a little bit of black wax because no project is complete without coloured waxes. Here's a few close-ups of how the piece finished up, and as you can see, I painted the inside of the lid in a pretty pink colour to contrast against the blue exterior. Here's a reminder of the boring brown piece I started out with, and here's the after.